we've spent, since I was born in 1964, we have spent now more than $1 trillion as a nation on a failed war on drugs. And today, drugs are cheaper, they're more plentiful, and they're easier to obtain, much more so than when we first began this drug war. And the numbers get worse by the year, and the statistics are more and more shocking. So why do we continue this policy? I'll talk a little bit later about the politics behind it, but let me lay out some of the basic economic problems and the basic policy problems of this drug war. First, when we talk about the international drug economy, there are three factors I'd like you to keep in mind. And the first one is extreme poverty around the world. There are about 1.2 billion people in this world who live on less than $1 a day. And roughly half the planet lives on less than $2 a day. And many of those people happen to live in places in the world where there's very little state presence. There's no government or police there to tell you you can't put a certain type of seed into the ground and come up with an illicit crop that's going to feed your family a lot better than growing fruits and vegetables. And a lot of these people happen to live in a lot of these ungoverned territories or relatively sparsely populated territories. This is a nighttime photo from NASA. It shows you where the major population centers are, measured by light output. So it's skewed toward people who have access to electricity, but nonetheless it gives you a sense of where the major population centers are. We have been, well, I say we because it's the United States government, and if you're a taxpayer, if you're a citizen, if you vote, we have to take some responsibility for these things, and we have a responsibility to stop them. But we've been spraying and trying to eradicate drugs from Colombia, particularly coca, where we get cocaine from, and poppies, where we get opium and heroin from this part of Colombia. And you can see most of it is dark here, and this area is the major are the historic growing areas for coca. We've also been trying to eradicate manually from Peru and Bolivia for many decades now. Now, Colombia alone is bigger than Texas and California combined. The same can be said of Peru, the same can be said of Bolivia. These are very large land masses. And when our politicians look at these maps and they think, well, we'll just spray here, here, and here, and it'll be done, right? These are huge, huge expanses of territory. If by some miracle we're able to eradicate these plants from this region, there is always sub-Saharan Africa is ripe for the picking. A lot of ungoverned territory, weak states, easy to corrupt. The narco dollars are plentiful, and it's easy to buy off police and politicians. Let's not forget that also Indonesia, before World War II, was a major exporter of cocaine. There were coca plantations there run by the Dutch. The Japanese had coca plantations in Taiwan, Iwo Jima. The US had coca plantations in Hawaii. So it's not just an Andean phenomenon. It'll grow in many different types of soils, many different types of climates. As long as it doesn't freeze, this plant will adapt to many different types of environments. There are varieties that do well in the Amazon basin on the jungle floor with these very acidic soils. There are other varieties that do well in the Andes mountains. And so it's very difficult then to try to eradicate these things, especially when there's an inexhaustible reservoir of poor peasant farmers around the world willing to take these risks. The second factor to keep in mind is high demand, undiminished demand in countries like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, but also increasingly middle-income countries like Brazil, Argentina, increasingly Mexico. These are now consuming countries. And as long as there is the hard currency in these countries to back up the demand, there, again, are just lots of people in this world willing to take the risk to supply that demand. The third factor to keep in mind is the artificial escalation of what is essentially relatively worthless weeds, shrubs, flowers, right? So cannabis, coca bushes, opium poppies, these are things that grow many different climates and soils. There's nothing magical about them, and they're very easy to produce. There's no reason their byproducts should be as expensive, as valuable as they are. These drugs ought to cost pennies per dose, but our policies of prohibition create a lot of wealth where there shouldn't be any wealth. And there are a couple of ways that happens. Number one, well, we've had a decades-long policy of interdiction. and eradication, trying to create artificial scarcity while the demand remains the same, thereby driving up prices and profits for people who remain in that economy. And also, we also throw more law enforcement and militarized solutions at this problem. So the higher the risk to the individual trafficker, the higher the risk premium they're able to charge the next person down the smuggling chain. So the longer the potential prison sentence they might have to serve, the greater the chance they'll be apprehended by the police, the greater the chance they might be killed by rivals or by law enforcement, the greater the risk reward for these people. So we create a tremendous indirect price support for drug traffickers. Put another way, you can buy a kilo of pure cocaine in the streets of Medellin for about, let's say, $1,500. It fluctuates from time to time, but let's say $1,500, give or take a couple of hundred. By the time you got it to the streets of the United States and brought it to our cities, and the dealers cut it up into individual gram bags and dilute it with whatever garbage they cut it with, you might be able to get $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. So what the users are paying for, ultimately, are transportation costs or the risks associated with transportation, right? If you sent that same kilogram by FedEx or DHL, it might cost you $100 or $200. So the more we escalate the war on drugs, the more valuable the drugs become, the more people get sucked into this economy, either out of desperation and poverty, or to feed their own addiction, or because they're greedy, or because they want to fund an insurgency, or they're part of organized crime. For whatever reason, we create this kind of irrational ATM machine that generates all this money. And this is why it's so difficult to stop. So the drug war contains the seeds of its own failure in many ways. Another problem is that our politicians, when they see this kind of illegal behavior, again, their knee-jerk reaction, their intuitive reaction, is to amplify law enforcement, right, to get you to stop breaking the law. And this has a number of unintended consequences or indirect consequences. I used to say unintended, but a lawyer recently corrected me and said, you've been saying this for so long now, they can't plead ignorance. There's now liability involved here, so these are indirect consequences. But one of those consequences is the Darwinian evolution of the drug trade. Right, so we caused this economy to evolve under principles, Darwinian principles, selection of the fittest. Right, and so as we throw more law enforcement at this problem year after year, the kinds of people we typically capture are the kinds of people who are dumb enough to get caught. No offense if anyone's ever been busted for anything in this room, but the slang expression on the street is that the dealer who uses loses. Right, so you get careless, you get sloppy, you get apprehended. And they violated their own operational security, they stayed on the phone too long, they bragged too much, they picked too many turf wars, they drew the attention of the state on them, they get caught. Conversely, year after year, the types of people we typically miss through law enforcement are the people who are the most innovative, the most adaptable, the most cunning. It's as though we've had this policy of artificial selection. We've been selectively breeding super traffickers. We've been thinning out the herd. Right, we have a filtering effect. And you can't hope to win a war on drugs when your policies see to it that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they thrive, because we've done two things indirectly to help them. Number one, we've picked off their competition for them, the inefficient traffickers. We've gotten rid of them and opened up that economic space to the efficient traffickers. And number two, again, we've tried to constrict a supply of drugs available while the demand remains the same, thereby driving up prices and profits. So that, it's somewhat analogous to how public health professionals say you shouldn't use antibacterial soaps and cleansers and don't take antibiotics every time you have a sore throat, because you end up killing off the weak strains of bacteria, and the drug-resistant strains, the superbugs, are the ones that are left and multiply in that space. Right? Now, that's the problem with going after the little fish. You end up creating super traffickers eventually. So some people say, well, forget about the little fish. Let's go after the kingpins, the super traffickers. We know who they are. Let's go after them. We've been doing that for decades as well. You probably remember the Medellin cartel run by Pablo Escobar, the Cali cartel that came afterwards. Well, we broke them up. We helped the Colombian government destroy these two dreaded gigantic cocaine cartels. And a lot of brave people died in the process, and you think, well, that should have at least put a big dent in the problem, right? I mean, we took out these two big monsters that dominated the global cocaine trade. And then more drugs than ever started coming out of Colombia. So what happened? To me, this is a really good example of the kind of hubris we see in Washington. For instance, our politicians will talk about democratizing things. We're going to democratize Cuba, Nicaragua, Iraq. I would argue that the only thing we've effectively democratized in Latin America through military force is the drug economy itself. In other words, we took out the two big monopolies, and we opened up this incredibly lucrative economic space to hundreds of smaller operators. Some of these are boutique cartels, some of them are family operated, some of them are vertically integrated, each with their own smuggling routes, their own list of officials they bribe. We can't even count the number of smaller operators that have taken over in that space, much less try to infiltrate and disrupt them. So that's the problem with going after the big fish. You end up democratizing the economy. Now, neither approach, going after big fish or little fish, takes into consideration why people continue to traffic in these drugs year after year. And if you don't understand the motivations of your adversary, then there's no way to stop them. And the motivations in this case is profit. And it's important to keep in mind that when you think of all this fighting and bloodshed in Mexico, in Colombia, in Afghanistan, and other places, what people are fighting for is the right to traffic, the right to distribute minimally processed agricultural commodities that ought to cost pennies per dose. So that's the real price of the drug war, is that we perpetuate the system. In Colombia, we have been targeting, this is the evil bush that we've been trying to eliminate, sorry, the other evil bush. Oh, sorry. A little partisan humor. Actually, no. The coca bush is not evil. Let me just stand up for the dignity of the coca leaf, because in places like Bolivia and Peru, indigenous peoples have used the coca leaf in a healthy, wholesome, natural way for thousands of years. It is a sacred leaf. It is referred to as mama coca, mother coca. It is a gift from the gods, and in its natural state, it is a very healthful leaf. It's good for fighting altitude sickness, it thwarts hunger, thirst, it's got all kinds of nutrients, it's got vitamins, minerals, iron, calcium, potassium, things that may be in short supply for people living in the high Andes, and it is a source of nourishment and a source of medicine and a spiritual plant for these peoples. In Colombia, there are two or three ethnic groups that have a history of using coca for traditional use, but the rest of it is used for the illicit market. And that's what this is. This coca bush is used for processing into coca paste, which gets turned into cocaine. And so we've been trying to destroy this through Plan Colombia by using crop dusters, essentially. And now we're starting to transition to manual eradication, which in many ways is much more violent because it's up close and personal. But we've been using the crop duster as our main instrument of our policy for the past decade. And we have since fumigated more than 3 million acres of Colombia, which is the second most biodiverse country in the world, an extremely delicate ecosystems we're talking about here. And we're using a broad spectrum herbicide. You can buy a very diluted form of it in your hardware store called Roundup. We're spraying a super concentrated version of this by air over large land masses. Even the stuff you buy in the hardware store comes with a spray applicator, so you hit the one weed you're trying to kill. We usually don't dump this stuff all over your yard, right? But this is what we've been doing. If you look at the topographical map of Colombia, it explains a lot about Colombia's development and also the conflict. By the way, there's been a 4.5-decade-old civil war in Colombia that's been raging since Lyndon Johnson sat in the White House. No side has been able to win this war yet. But if you look at the map of Colombia, and particularly if you drew a line diagonally down Colombia, you could see on this side, on the northwestern side, is where the major population centers are, between the three fingers of chains of the Andes. And in these very fertile valleys, you see a lot of road networks. These are the red lines you see. Now, if you go to this part of Colombia, you'll notice something. The red lines basically stop. This is territory that's been essentially abandoned by the state. This is where also a lot of the coca was initially grown. When we began Plan Colombia, we were trying to eradicate coca from provinces like Putumayo, Caquetá, Guaviare, and these other regions as well. And as a result of our spraying, we've now pushed coca cultivation into all the regions of Colombia, as well as pushing it back over international borders. So in the previous decade, Peru was the number one producer of coca leaf. Then the problem, as we eradicated in Peru, manually exploded in Colombia. And as we have now been pushing on Colombia, it's going back across the border into Peru and some into Bolivia as well. So it's the balloon effect, right? You squeeze on one end of the balloon, the other end expands. Or as Senator Ted Stevens once called it, whack-a-mole. We've been playing whack-a-mole with coca cultivation all over the continent. Now, there's a good reason why these peasant farmers continue to grow coca. If you look at the lack of infrastructure here, that explains a lot. Because you can cut down some rainforest, slash and burn agriculture, and then plant a couple of acres of coca bushes, harvest those leaves, and in a very basic jungle laboratory, backyard laboratory, they call them labs, but they're actually like backyard stills. I mean, they're that simple, that basic. It's just a piece of wood on the ground with a plastic tarp to keep the rain off and a couple of drums for barrels for gasoline. And they use a weed whacker and a few basic chemicals. So basically you use gasoline, sulfuric acid, cement, ammonia, and a few other chemicals to process the coca leaf into coca paste. And if you ever see how this stuff is made, you don't want to put it up your nose. I mean, that's the best prevention message I can think of. In fact, if you want to see how this process is done from beginning to end, you can go to the web and Google the phrase shoveling water and my name. That's the name of the video, shoveling water. It's about 15, 20 minutes long. And basically I spent a day with these farmers making the coca paste, so you can see how it's done. This guy is holding the end product here, which is the coca paste. And this is what it looks like up close. Now the reason this is important is that this is less than a kilo here, about 3/4 of a kilo. That is easy to transport. Because if you don't have roads, if you don't have vehicles, you can throw this into a backpack and walk to the nearest village and sell it. Or the traffickers or the guerrillas or the right-wing paramilitary death squads will come to your farm, pay you cash, and take it away for you. That solves your transportation problem. Instead, we have been demanding that these people stop doing this, which is illegal, and grow legal crops instead, to grow thousands of pounds of fruits and vegetables to transport on vehicles they don't have, over roads that literally don't exist, to sell in markets, both domestic and export, they can't get access to, and even if they could, to compete against cheap agribusiness imports, very often subsidized by our tax dollars, against which these peasant farmers don't stand a chance. So what farmers in Washington state would grow tons of asparagus or soybean if they had no vehicles, no access to markets? Who farms to go out of business? And yet this is what we've been expecting these farmers to do, our government. And it hasn't been working. The things we take for granted in this country, we expect to see roads and transportation infrastructure. These just don't exist in a lot of regions around the world, including rural Colombia. This is a major road in the province of Guaviare. This connects the capital of that province with the rest of the province. So, and ironically, this was taken during the dry season after a thunderstorm, but the other 9 months of year when it rains, it really sucks to be a farmer. And you know something about rain living in the Northwest, I guess. But you have pavement. Now, look at this picture. Would you rather transport a kilo of coca paste or a truckload of cattle or vegetables or fruits? Because across this mess here is the rest of the province. And those farmers, if they want to sell legal crops to the rest of the country, have to deal with infrastructure problems like this. And your farm, if you're a peasant farmer, could be several miles off of this dirt road. So just grass or just a dirt path. And so just to get all those pineapples and fruits and vegetables to the nearest road, and to hope that a truck will come along that'll have some space and you'll have money to pay them to transport it, that by the time you got to the nearest city, your neighbors haven't done the exact same thing and grow the same crops, and that your prices won't plummet or your crops won't rot by the time you get there. So we've been trying to eradicate it through crop dusters. This is a fleet run by the State Department, flown by former military pilots. Some people call them mercenaries because they're paid a lot of money to fly very dangerous quasi-military missions. And the official position of the State Department is that we are flying at basically head-top level, like you do in Kansas, but we aren't in Kansas anymore. This is Colombia. People shoot at these planes. The guerrillas will shoot at them. This pilot's been pointing at a bullet hole that's been patched on his plane. And because the guerrillas shoot at these planes, we have to send escort helicopter gunships to put down suppressing fire in case someone shoots at them. And so as a result, these pilots fly much higher than they're supposed to, way above treetop level. And there are, the farmers don't need to clear all this land. They just need to clear enough to grow the coca crops. And so these trees become obstacles. And so the pilots fly high. And about 10 seconds after the plane leaves the field of vision here, this stream of spray turns into a giant gas cloud. And the closest analogy I can think of, after seeing it up close, is if you've ever seen those World War I newsreels of poison gas attacks in Europe, it's kind of like that. The giant gas cloud just hangs in the field and is slowly carried by the wind. And as it moves around, it affects all kinds of surrounding environments, hits food crops. If you're a peasant farmer, these planes come without warning for good reason, because if you warn the farmers they're coming, the guerrillas might come and shoot them down. And so you're caught out in the open, your children may be playing out in the fields, your livestock is out there, and it's impossible to get to the edge of this giant cloud without running, inhaling, and getting into your lungs and all of your body. In this case, here's a close-up of a spray plane going over this campesino's house. Campesino's a peasant farmer. And you can see they just did some slash and burn here. Those tree trunks just lie in the field. They don't need to remove them. It's not mechanized agriculture. And these little green rows are little coca plants that are starting to come up. And they're spraying over a house, which is technically illegal, but it happens all the time. Another spray plane. This is a Black Hawk helicopter, which is one of the big ticket items under Plan Colombia. And this is a counter-narcotics helicopter donated, a Huey helicopter donated to the Colombian government, with a counter-narcotics machine gun mounted on the side. If you can tell me the difference between a counter-narcotics machine gun and a counterinsurgency machine gun, please let me know. It's a distinction without a difference, but it's an important distinction because this began under Plan Colombia began under President Clinton, who, along with the early Bush administration, promised Congress, promised the American people, don't worry, we're not going to get sucked into an endless civil war. We're only there to fight drugs. This is strictly about counter-narcotics. And then September 11th happened. And that gave the hardliners in the Bush administration the excuse they needed to declare Colombia to be the southern front in the global war on terror, even though the FARC guerrillas had nothing to do with al-Qaeda. They don't speak the same language. These are atheists versus fundamentalists, et cetera, et cetera. But that gave them the ability then to take all the previous money that had been used for counter-narcotics to use it as counter-terrorism to go after guerrillas. This is a view of Putumayo province from the air, from a Black Hawk. Looking down, you can see there's lots of Amazon River tributaries. It's green on green. There are more shades of green here than Crayola has in their inventory. And if you're a spray pilot flying over this, looking down on green, it's very difficult to tell the difference between coca and food crops and other types of plants. And you have a split second to push your spray button to release that chemical. If you miss that time, you're over someone else's farm or some other region. Now, this is what it looks like on the ground. This is a cattle pasture that's been cleared, and this is what looks like after we've fumigated. Basically, our chemicals destroy anything green. And Monsanto, the manufacturer of the chemical, says don't let your livestock graze on these lands after they've been sprayed. Let it dry thoroughly. Don't let your children play on these things. But these are poor farmers. They can't afford expensive corrals, much less industrial animal feed to feed them from alternative sources. This is one of the few successful types of alternative economic development in the region. Aquaculture, where peasant farmers have been taught to grow tilapia for protein, very sensitive also to the spraying, and we sprayed that as well. This should all be green, by the way. All the grasses turn brown. This is an agricultural school where we teach farmers, funded by international development agencies, to grow other crops besides coca. Guess what we did? We sprayed that as well, by accident, always by accident, as they say. And this is a close-up of what happens to these crops after they've been sprayed. So these are plantains, bananas, papayas, corn, Corn and yucca are particularly sensitive to these chemicals. This is an orange tree with a couple of oranges left, and the leaves have all been defoliated. This is a pasture. No coca going on here, but the pilot completely, I mean, I don't know what they were thinking. They were just emptying their tanks and just dumped it over this vast stretch of land here. Beautiful environment, by the way. It reminds me of Jurassic Park. You kind of expect to see velociraptors running down the hills. But it's been scorched. This is a children's mural from the region, and it says it better than my words. This is how they see it from before, during the spraying, and after. This farmer is one that Witness for Peace and I have been following since the beginning of Plan Colombia. He did exactly what our government asked him to do, which is that in 2000 they realized the fumigations would begin the next year, Plan Colombia would start, and they voluntarily tore up their coca plants. They borrowed money, and they realized they could grow peppercorns and hearts of palm and sell them across the border in Ecuador and still make a bit of a profit. And he even went so far as to put up the 30-foot poles with a white flag on top to tell the pilots, don't spray me, please. I'm not growing any coca. We have since sprayed him and his farm 4 times, accidentally. 3 times directly and 1 time through aerial drift when the winds picked up the chemicals when they were attacking a neighboring farm. This is the last time they were sprayed, and I happened to be there a week after the spray planes came. And again, this is the rainy season, everything should be green. The little yellowing plants down here are the little hearts of palm seedlings they were trying to grow. And this woman remains, she and her husband remained at that time one of only 2 families to receive any kind of compensation for wrongful fumigation, despite there being more than 10,000 complaints in this one province alone. It's very difficult, almost impossible, and if I hadn't been there with a digital camera, the chances are they wouldn't have gotten any compensation at all. Close-up of their farm. This is her water source. This hose goes into her house, so we poison her drinking water as well. And the human health effects, you hear this over and over again. In the region, there's a lot of vomiting, diarrhea, skin rashes, and infant deaths. And when I take these kinds of photos to the U.S. Embassy, they tell me, you can't prove this was us. You can't prove this was done by our chemicals. These people live in a jungle. It's very humid. It could be a fungus, or it could be insect bites or whatever. And they have a point to some extent. We were not there to watch these people get sprayed, measure the dosage, and watch them get sick over time. That would be unethical. We kind of executed Nazi doctors for experimenting on human beings, right? The precautionary principle says you don't do this until you can prove it's safe for humans. You don't experiment on them. And the tests that the State Department uses refer to how Roundup is used in North America, which is very different from how it's being used here. And so you can see her arms. This woman was caught in the spray planes a week before. So that's Colombia. Now we have reduced somewhat the cultivation in Colombia in terms of the numbers of acres under cultivation, but globally, but in terms of the output, the farmers and the traffickers have adapted. We talked a little bit about the Darwinian evolution of these things. Well, they also adapt to our fumigation patterns. So they no longer plant in the open in these large expanses. There are shade-grown varieties of coca now. They will intercrop them with other crops to make it harder to detect. And they are planting different varieties of coca. Just as there's different varieties of tomatoes and corn and whatnot, there are different varieties of coca, some of which have much more yield per plant and are much bushier. And their extraction techniques have also become more efficient. So the output per acre has gone up, even though we've diminished the amount of cultivation overall. And at the beginning of Plan Colombia, in the year 2000, about 90% of the cocaine in the United States originated from Colombia. The DEA is able to determine this through gas chromatography and different techniques to figure out exactly which regions the cocaine came from, where it was grown. And I met with the drug czar's office last month, and I said, it still hasn't changed. After 10 years of Plan Colombia, we still get about 90% of our cocaine in the United States from Colombia. And they corrected me. They said, no, it's actually 97% today. Why they would admit that to me, of all people, I don't know. But actually, the guy who admitted to me is not a career drug warrior. He's actually retired from the Air Force. He's had a full career, and I don't think he has a dog in this fight particularly. And there are a lot of people who work in the drug war who don't necessarily like what's going on. And some of those I consider sources. So now that we've talked about Colombia a bit, let's move on to Mexico, and I'll wrap it up after that. In Mexico, you know from the headlines, it's an absolute bloodbath. Since President Calderon was elected in December of 2006, very razor-thin margin, hotly contested election. 36,000 people have been killed in his drug wars. He chose to bring the military into this and to throw it against the Colombian cartels. Cartels is actually a misnomer. The word cartel implies that they're working together to fix prices, to maximize profits. They're actually killing each other and fighting each other. So they're properly called drug trafficking organizations, DTOs, rather than cartels. Better definition of cartel might be the health insurance industry in the United States. Right? Sorry, the profit insurance industry in the United States. Health is secondary. But these cartels, and I'll use that term in the vernacular, have been waging a turf war with each other, which was just simmering when President Calderon came into office, but because he came in with a deficit of legitimacy, he thought he would do something bold and decisive. He would throw 50,000 army troops at this problem. He couldn't use the federal police or the state police or the municipal police because they were hopelessly corrupted in working in league with the cartels, and so he threw the military at this problem. It was an ill-conceived, ill-timed war designed to make him look like a tough guy, a decisive wartime leader, not unlike a certain other president who went into an ill-considered war. But as a result of doing this, he actually made the problem infinitely worse. This is kind of the political problem we face with politicians and elected officials. When they want to see simple solutions, knee-jerk solutions, they think the voters will only understand knee-jerk solutions. And the problem is that a lot of these problems have solutions that are counterintuitive. Right? What do I mean by counterintuitive? You've seen these before. These are Mexican finger traps or Chinese finger cuffs. The knee-jerk solution of how to get out of this is to pull. But the harder you pull, the stucker you get. Right? It's counterintuitive to think that you actually relax a bit and push in even, and that's how you extract yourself from this problem. And politicians are afraid that voters won't understand complex or long-winded answers, and so they do the reflexive thing. Mexico is on fire. What do you do? What do you do when you see a fire? Throw water on it, right? Isn't that common sense? Have you ever had a grease fire in your kitchen or an electrical fire? Don't put water in a group. Very good. You learned the hard way, did you? It's a very bad idea. And so this is the problem. We have a prohibition-driven war and a turf war at that. And see, the two things that make this very different from a conventional problem, conventional military problem. That is to say that these half dozen or so cartels are fighting each other over the right to traffic in these strategic corridors. And the reason they're fighting over this is where the tunnels are located, where they might smuggle stuff across the border, or this is where the crossing points are, where they bribed officials on both sides of the border to make sure their shipments go through. So these become very strategic pathways and worth fighting over. This is very, very profitable. Similarly, with a number of ports along the coast where drugs can be brought in, that's why there's a turf war. And the reason that using the military against this problem is counterproductive is that the turf wars ought to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Right? At the end of the day, there will be new lines that are established. I will traffic in this area, you will traffic in this area, you will traffic in that area, and we will go back to the quiet business of making lots of money. Turf wars are bad for business. You can get killed. Your lieutenants might even kill you in this mix, or the state will kill you. It's very bad for business. And so, by using the military against these cartels, if you weaken one of them, the other half dozen think, this is our turn to take over their turf because they've been weakened. And then you attack another one, and another one gets weakened, and then so on and so forth. This goes back and forth. They will never find that end game. And ultimately, they're looking for some sort of pax narcotica, right, when they go back to the business of making lots of money, which is what they're about. This used to exist back in before 2000, and a lot of this has to do with the monopoly of power that the PRI had, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. which they finally lost in 2000. But before that, there was a kind of a tacit agreement with the different traffickers, and that was that as long as you didn't commit massacres, you didn't commit turf wars, you didn't do extortion, kidnapping, etc., that we could, that you would be allowed to traffic an acceptable amount of drugs if you greased the right palms, bribed the right people, and everything had to be done quietly. And this is what existed for many, many, many years. Mexico has always been a conduit for drugs in the United States. And it's only recently that this thing has exploded because of these turf wars. And so what happens then, and I asked the Assistant Secretary of State, Roberta Jacobson, 2 months ago in Washington, what's our strategy? I see tactics, but I see no strategy. She said, well, our basic point is to fracture these drug trafficking, or to break up these cartels, fracture them. And I said, can you point to any evidence in the history of our drug war where fracturing cartels has made any difference, has made the situation better? Because we've been doing that for decades, right? We fractured the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel. What happens when you break up a big cartel? You lower the barriers to entry for everyone else who wants to get in on this game. And once they get in on it, they're not going to play kumbaya with their fellow traffickers. They're going to vie for supremacy until there's one or two big entities that remain. And then we fracture them again and repeat the process, right? Rinse, lather, repeat. That's why I say we have tactics but no strategy. And so that's been the problem in Mexico. And apart from the human toll of this, which has been horrific, there's also another casualty to this, which is the social contract in Mexico. And that is something that's deeply troubling to me because it's easy to destroy that social fabric. It can take decades or generations to rebuild. The idea that the state is capable of providing basic security, basic services to the people has been deeply eroded, if not destroyed. And because the prohibition-related violence has gotten so out of hand and so spectacular, and the government has not been able to contain it, it has sent a green light to all other types of criminals who want to get in on the act. It's become a free-for-all now. So people that don't necessarily have anything to do with drug trafficking can get in the act in terms of kidnapping, extortion, home invasions. It's a generalized free-for-all. It's kind of an anarchy situation. And Colombia is just now emerging from that mess that started in the late 80s, early 90s with extreme violence and the breakdown of trust in the state, and they're just beginning to have some faith in government again. So that's the mess we have right now. There are some signs for hope. I'm a former historian, and I'll tell you the only thing that's inevitable is change itself, and sometimes the change is even for the better. There have been some signs of positive change. The fact that Prop 19 in California achieved 46.5% is the highest we've ever had for a bid to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana. The rest of Latin America is looking at California and at other states like Washington, Oregon, Colorado to see if some state will come out and legalize. And if that survives a federal challenge, then it gives political space to these other countries to tell our State Department to take a hike. That we've had this policy of certification where we basically strong-arm other governments into towing the line on our drug war. And if California, our largest population state, most populous state, decides to change directions, it gives other countries the ability to say, look, if your major state can't have a consensus on this, then where do you get the arrogance to impose this policy on us? For the first time during the YouTube summit this year, President Obama was once again asked about legalization, and this time he didn't make a joke out of it. And he said even though he disagrees with it, he believes it's a legitimate topic for debate. That's more than any president has ever said on this subject. We also have former President Vicente Fox in Mexico coming out over and over again saying the violence in Mexico will not stop until the U.S. legalizes drugs. Last year, 3 former heads of state in Latin America, former President Zedillo of Mexico, former President Gaviria of Colombia, and Cardoso of Brazil, all signed a joint statement calling for an end to the war on drugs and at least the legalization of cannabis as a beginning. So this is shifting. Other countries have decriminalized. Portugal has decriminalized all drug possession. Colombia has decriminalized since 1994 by Supreme Court. They have this odd notion that the sovereignty of the individual, you own your own body and you can't be thrown into prison for what you do with it. Whereas in the United States, it's a radical concept, especially if you're a woman. Your uterus, of course, belongs to the Republican Party. And so this is a growing trend throughout the world that people are starting to realize the drug war hasn't worked, and they're beginning to roll things back. So on that optimistic note, I'll end this.
So I studied the political economy of the drug war as connected to a strategy not to eliminate drugs exactly, but as to a set of strategies to produce what we call neoliberalization, or free trade agreements, especially throughout the Americas. And what I'm going to do is review just a little bit of history that might help you understand that, which is in the 1980s, there was a big debt crisis in Latin America. And one of the things that was going on in the United States at the same time, of course, was a domestic politics of fear around drugs designed to produce political capital for both parties, Republicans and Democrats. So one of those things that the Republicans and Democrats did in the 1980s was go after Latin America, saying that's where the drugs came from. And as a result, we put a lot of pressure on governments in Latin America to do the sorts of things that became Plan Colombia, the Merit Initiative, Plan Dignidad, and so forth later on. Latin American governments were reluctant to do this, and what we did, of course, was withhold the possibility of helping them out with their debt crisis as long as they would go after, of course, especially coca farmers and so forth. This caused a lot of tension between the US and Latin America. And in 1990, George Bush met with the presidents of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador to talk to them about what they wanted from the United States in exchange for waging a war on drugs. And what they told President Bush was, we want free trade, basically. So when George Bush comes back to the United States after this meeting, he announces the Enterprise for the Americas Initiative, which is the proto-free trade area agreement of the Americas plan. This smoothed over things with Latin American countries until the mid-1990s, when Republicans gained control of Congress in 1994, the midterm elections. And Bill Clinton, as a result, decided to get tough on drugs, and especially what that meant was getting tough on Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. What this did was actually put on hold the possibility of free trade agreement, especially with Colombia, which was actually next in line for a free trade agreement with the US after Mexico. It's still trying to get that free trade agreement. And in exchange for trying to get that free trade agreement, the aid through Plan Colombia is quite essential. So what happened, what Sanho described, the breakup of the duopoly in Colombia, was directly the result of Ernesto Samper trying to please the Clinton administration, and as a result, of course, fracturing, as he mentioned, the narco-capitalist industry in Colombia. Plan Colombia itself, as he mentioned, also comes about under Clinton in the context of an extreme economic crisis in Colombia. Negative growth rates. The debt crisis really hits Colombia last of all Latin American countries. And in 1998, they were up a creek without a paddle. The president of Colombia came to both the US and the EU for aid, and the US said, here, have some aid. And of course, it was military aid. You know the rest of the story because Sanho told it to you. After 9/11, of course, that aid was allowed to be used essentially as a guerrilla pacification strategy within Colombia. Finally, with respect to Mexico and our support for Mexico's war on drugs, it's especially framed through the Merida Initiative, which was something that came out in roughly 2006 as a way to provide security assistance to Mexico and Central America, which more or less meant military hardware and so forth. Legitimized by the idea that actually what we have now is both NAFTA, right, and CAFTA, free trade areas that are not throughout Latin America but extend down to Panama. And the idea was we need to protect this economic territory, and therefore we're going to use the war on drugs to do so. So that's a brief overview of how the war on drugs, which I completely agree with Sanho, has no particular authentic strategy associated with it, but has been connected to other kinds of strategy that have been designed to securitize essentially free market economies. So that's a little taste of what I do and what I teach, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
What I want to share with you is a little bit about the work that I do from the perspective of medicine and the role that medicine and certain types of public health, or I call fake public health or faux public health, have played in justifying setting up the types of structures, legal structures and classifications for these different substances that we've been talking about tonight that allow them to be used as political footballs and allow, as Dominic once said at a global health conference that we were in, allow people with guns rather than people with white coats to help us decide what to do with these kinds of substances. And really, it's a sorry, sad tale of ignorance and racism, and the usual kind of stew of things that allow, sexism, all the general stuff that allows us humans to cloud our thinking about things. And so, what work I've been doing is around trying to get those errors that we have in our American policy, federal policy, specifically around drug scheduling, classifications, trying to get institutional support from the medical community and other voices that would have sort of scientific authority to say, hold on a second, I think we've really been quite irresponsible with the way that we've treated these substances and people who would consume them. I mean, certainly ultimately we're talking about the human cost here, but remember this is all through, justified through the proxy of the idea that these things are just so bad for you, and we have to do all that we can, and all these collateral costs are acceptable to get these bad things out of our systems and out of our communities and all that kind of rhetoric. But so on cannabis, we didn't even talk Sanho's work, and through the Latin Colombia's his discussion on Colombia, we weren't talking a lot about cannabis, but about coca and opium. But if you look at the international treaties that were signed in 1961 was the first major sort of comprehensive international treaty where all the countries kind of got bullied into, let's put this all together, and these three plants, opium, coca, cannabis, and a bunch of other substances, let's internationally control them and let governments have monopoly over them, because they're just, and there's all this testimony, public health, governments, and different delegates were saying, yes, we believe that, this substance should be regulated and controlled. But most of the meeting, if you look at the notes, focused on cannabis. It's very interesting. All their extra special sessions that they had with various countries, everyone agreed, yeah, we need to sort of control coca, we need to control opium just to let pharmaceutical companies regulate it, and let's get rid of all this indigenous use, and let's these countries that have had this long-standing indigenous use, we'll give them 25 years to phase all that, primitive business out, so that they can become civilized like us in the, in this case, the West, a certain view of the West in that time, which was predominantly Protestant, Eurocentric, view of acceptable drugs. So anyway, I'm going on a little bit of a history lesson here too, but it's when you dig into that, you see how much sort of race and class issues overshadowed the real health data. So with cannabis, I think it's worth talking about as a local issue, because that's our coca, that's our plant in the United States. That's kind of the symbol of our drug war. Where in Colombia or Bolivia, the president gets sworn in on coca, on a pile of coca leaves on their indigenous flag. So that's their symbol, and potentially, I don't know if anyone's using opium as a symbol in traditional opium growing areas, but it really does go to this kind of political ecology. So cannabis issue, where we're at right now is that the federal government classifies it as a Schedule I drug with no accepted medical use and treatment, and highly unsafe for use under medical supervision, and high potential for abuse. Does anybody believe that? Okay. Can you believe we've had that policy for 41 years, that position? And, despite overwhelming evidence that everyone's sort of just laughing, and it's unbelievable, but that's where we're at, and that's because, you have certain policymakers that were relying on, we can talk more about the reasons why, but honestly, now we have the two largest physician groups in America saying that this classification is ridiculous and needs to be reviewed. And so, when will our federal government, the people who have the reins over this, wake up and smell the science? I don't know. Maybe when we as a people decide that we don't want to live in a kind of pre-Galilean Earth is the center of the universe kind of world. I mean that took a long time for that to change. I mean, Copernicus published his things in 1500s, and 100 years before the Catholic Church said, "Oh, okay, you can look in your telescope."
So that is really the question that I want to start off with. I mean, we've heard a lot tonight about the failures of the drug war, the perils of the drug war, the harms of the drug war. And Sanho said, basically it sounded like you said the political will isn't there to end it and to begin a legalization and regulation of these substances because politicians are afraid that the American people won't understand.
Well, there's an op-ed I wrote called "Drug War Has Failed. What Comes Next?" It's on the table over there, and it kind of lays it out in terms of what first thing we need to do is develop a different vocabulary. And the Americans, we're simple people. We like simple answers, right? And so what team do we root for? Which choice is it? Is it A or B? We like to think in simple binary solutions, options, and it carries over to the poverty of our political discourse, right? The Eskimos, the Inuit, have some 24 words to describe snow. We have 2 words to describe politics, Democrat or Republican. And yet every human society that's ever existed in the face of the earth has had a different way to organize its politics, its economics, its culture, from totalitarian fascism on one end to anarchism on the other end. There's a whole spectrum of solutions we're not allowed to consider, except these 2 little narrow points on the spectrum that are increasingly so close together Kate Moss couldn't squeeze between them. We're being robbed of a spectrum of possibilities, and that carries over into the way we talk about drugs. And so the drug warriors would like to talk about prohibition, either you're for zero tolerance on prohibition in the drug war, or, as I've been accused of, wanting to sell heroin and candy machines to children. In fact, there's a whole spectrum of regulatory possibilities we're not allowed to talk about, and so I don't like to use the term legalization because it's been co-opted and poisoned by the drug warriors. I prefer to talk about regulation because that's what I want to see. I want to find more controls over these things, not less, and we can't regulate substances that we deliberately drive underground. The great myth of prohibition is that prohibition doesn't mean we control drugs. It means we've given up the right to control drugs. We choose not to regulate, and we're paying the price for that anarchy. And so there's a whole regulatory spectrum we can talk about. People of goodwill can be on different parts of that spectrum. Some of us may prefer tighter regulation, some of us more libertarian regulation, but none of us really exist on these false poles of anarchism versus prohibition. We're all somewhere in the middle, and we've been robbed of those choices.
First comment, I completely agree with Sanho here. But first, we've got to figure out how to regulate capitalism and to make that palatable to people. That actually, to envision a post-prohibition world without talking about how to regulate capitalism is to really not be, the vision, it doesn't make any sense, actually. That's the thing. One of the major problems with legalization, actually, or regulation, is also state policy for actually producing jobs, producing democratic economic growth, essentially. Because, as he pointed out in his lecture, actually there are a lot of people who are making a living off of illicit drugs, coca, cannabis, and so forth, and actually a post-prohibition regime would put those people out of work, right? And that's part of the problem, is there's no work for them. They don't have a way to make a living. And as a result, that's why they're involved in these economies. Until we can want to seriously consider how we do capitalism, it's very difficult to consider how we regulate actually a post-prohibition illicit drug economy.
How would it put them out of work? Couldn't they start selling to a legal
Well,
regulated market?
I like Roger Goodman's answer. We have to actually really control marketing, that actually advertising. We've got to be very, very careful about how these commodities are sold, and to have a concerted effort to provide education so that people can make informed decisions about how they consume.
Right.
Quick can jump in. So I believe that we need to revalue these substances and do them on an individual by individual basis. I mean, some of the things that Sanho had mentioned, that these are worthless weeds, and I know that he's using that terminology in a way to talk about the price inflation prohibition tariff, but I mean the above board value of these things, though they might be cheap to produce, is actually, that's what we need to talk about, the revaluation of these substances. And once you start doing that, start seriously saying, well, geez, how valuable is coca? Not just in its completely processed form. It takes 10%. Let's see, what is it? 2,000 pounds of coca leaves to make 5 pounds of powder cocaine, something like that, on that order of extraction. And powder cocaine is in our pharmacies. It's all over the world, and it's used for medicine. So we do know it's valuable. But the less concentrated forms might have all kinds of value, and we know that from long-standing indigenous use. Let's be serious about that. And how many people's lives have been saved from having access to coca tea when they've had severe diarrhea in the Amazonia? I've heard those stories. Lives saved. I mean, that becomes very valuable to you, not worthless. Same for altitude sickness and a couple of other things. So it's that whole shifting, your revaluing it will get us to think about, we should have it available in certain ways. And then of course I'll talk about. Well, cannabis. Could go on about its values. It's fascinating how many things that humankind can benefit from its stalk, for fiber and cellulose, from its seeds for food, and from its flowers for medicine. I can go on about that, but so that requires a whole revaluation. Then we're gonna have to start seriously talking about, these guys talked about commodification and advertising, but what about the question about local production and the whole idea of these organizations talk about food sovereignty and farmers markets, and what about plant sovereignty and drug sovereignty, and the idea that this local plant, coca, opium, cannabis, is part of my natural environment, and I have the right to produce it at home and share it, in some fashion with my community. I mean, that not all of us are always going to be, necessarily wanting to get our things in a commodified fashion. That's why that's why food farmers markets are so popular. So I think the same kind of vision would be there for these other substances, and we have to also kind of allow that to be there. And that could be messy, but it's real.